Hi, my name is Steve Rahi. I am a customer engineer focused on management technologies. Today's discussion focuses on Endpoint Analytics, which is part of Microsoft Endpoint Manager. Now, as I've done these sessions in the past, you may or may not have noticed the titles that I've been using, and they have changed over time. But very often, a title will start Microsoft Endpoint Manager, Config Manager, and then the subject of the session, or Microsoft Endpoint Manager Intune and the subject of the session. That's probably going to become more a thing of the past because there's so much unification that's happening between Config Manager and Intune integration and so on. That'll still happen probably for a while, and who knows, right? But specifically this title, Endpoint Analytics, it is not really a subject for just Config Manager. It's not really a subject for just Intune. It's a subject for both. And so I'm not calling anything out separate here. It will be a session that talks about both, right? And so we will get right into it. Also, as we look at the agenda, a lot of the times when we get into discussions like this, I will get into the details of how things work, right, on the client side, or troubleshooting Intune, or things like that. That's not the case here. This technically is very, very simple to set up, right? But it's also very, very impactful and important for your business. There's a classification of features that let me say it this way. Generally, I will not call out that every organization on the planet needs to have a certain feature enabled. There are certain features that is true of, such as the Cloud Management Gateway, and so on. This is another one of them, right? Very, very useful and impactful data that your organization can have access to incredibly easily. And so to not turn this on just seems like such a wasted opportunity that every organization, frankly, on the planet that has Config Manager or Intune should turn this on right away. Right? So here's the agenda. What is Endpoint Analytics? Why do we care? We'll go through it in a couple of different scenarios, and then we will wrap up with some troubleshooting tips and tricks. So jumping right into it, what is this thing that we call Endpoint Analytics? Well, put simply, Endpoint Analytics is related to the Microsoft Productivity Score. Now, I say related to because it is not it is not equivalent to the Microsoft Productivity Score. So what is the Microsoft Productivity Score? So the Productivity Score is basically something we will show you that's intended to support your journey toward digital transformation and also give you insights about how your organization uses M365 and the technology experiences that support it, right? The Microsoft Productivity Score also reflects a combination of people and technology experience measurements in your organization and can be compared to benchmarks from organizations similar in size to yours. Right? The productivity score really focuses in on a couple of areas. One is metrics, and these metrics are really to help you see where you are on your digital transformation journey. We provide insights about the data that you have, and the goal of that is to help you identify opportunities to improve productivity and satisfaction in your org, and then also recommended actions that you can take toward that end. That's what the Microsoft Productivity Score is. Endpoint Analytics specifically is a contributing piece to the Microsoft Productivity Score. Right? Endpoint Analytics will give you insights. So what are those insights? Well, those insights could be recommended software, right? Recommendations for providing your best user experience for software. Could be proactive remediation scripting. So your ability to use scripting to fix common support issues before the end user really even notices or opens help desk tickets. Could be startup performance, here to help IT get users from power on to productivity quickly and without any delays. And so these are three areas where we're starting. These insights are three areas where we're starting. These, if you look at our documentation, you will clearly see in a couple of places that we indicate these are starting points. These are not finish points, right? It's where we're introducing this with the intention to expand this as we go along. So that's what the what Endpoint Analytics is and how it kind of relates. So why do we care, right? Why do we care about endpoint analytics? Well, we've already talked about some of them. The ability to proactively identify issues is huge. You want to find out what those issues are and make positive, proactive changes for your end users before they start to notice it themselves as a pattern and call the help desk. Increased IT visibility. So your ability to see in your environment places where there may be trouble spots because of legacy hardware or suboptimal software configurations or configurations in general, maybe that you just missed somehow or got overlooked, right? Maybe broadly you're okay, but in certain scenarios you may not be. And so this is to help expose that. Increasing information worker productivity. So the time that information workers spend dealing with issues is costly for your organization in terms of their performance, reliability, support, all sorts of things, right? So really trying to focus in on those areas and help in those areas. So there are a couple of scenarios where we will talk about this. Really, endpoint analytics is a common place for being able to see this kind of data. You'll see in a minute that there is a specific place where you will see endpoint analytics data, but there's two pathways to get there. One path is if your devices are managed by Intune. The other path is if your devices are managed by configuration managers. That's why I called out at the beginning of this session, this is not a specific config manager or Intune session. It is a session that will talk about both. And so let's start with Intune and talk about some of the details there. And again, the technical requirements here, they just aren't that big, right? It's not really that big of a challenge. There are a couple of things I'll call out. So when it comes to Intune, there are some requirements here. First, the devices need to be either Intune enrolled or co-managed. If we're talking about Intune, they need to be Intune enrolled, right? If we're talking about Config Manager, then they need to be co-managed. And there's some nuance in between those, right? So I'll just leave that there. The Windows OS version 1903 or better, you need to have a supported operating system, which I'll list here. We support either Azure AD Joined or hybrid Azure AD Joined, no problem. As far as permissions, we list these here. So Intune Service Admin for gathering data, to start gathering data. Explain what that means in just a second. And other roles as you see fit to be able to read the data, see the data, whatever. Proactive remediation scripting. So if you want to do proactive remediation scripting, which you probably do want to do, then you need the device to be co-managed and the client app's workload shifted to Intune or just Intune managed, right? And then in terms of licensing, these are the requirements that you see, and internet endpoints, the one that I show you on the screen, right? So I may say this again, but I'll raise it here, and it may seem a bit tangential, but I want to call it out. So when you think about endpoints, the question might come to you, as I had from one customer, when the data comes from endpoint analytics, is it sent directly to the internet or is it somehow routed differently? And the answer is it totally depends on how you're doing this. If you're managing the device with Intune, then it is going to go directly through the internet to Intune, which is where this endpoint is really important. If you're managing with Config Manager, then the devices do not send their data directly to the internet. They go through Config Manager, and then Config Manager sends the data, forwards it to the internet as appropriate, right? So that enters into some different discussions about proxies and what you need to do with your proxy. If it's just Config Manager that needs to have access to certain endpoints, we haven't even gotten to Config Manager yet, then that's where you need to worry about it, is on the Config Manager site server side and site system role side to make sure that that role can get access across the endpoints. And if it's Intune, though, you need to make sure your proxies allow access to this particular endpoint. And more on that probably in a minute, may even say it again. But let's pause and park Config Manager discussion for a minute. And instead, let's go and talk about Intune. How do you enable this with Intune? Well, so before I even pull this up, I will tell you that what you're going to see is not what you're going to see if you probably do this for yourself, right? I've already enabled this, And so, because I wanted to be able to show you the demos and so on. And so I've already enabled it. And so if I go to my Endpoint Analytics section, which I'm going to do two ways. First, aka.ms/endpoint analytics, right? That is one way. I'm going to pull that up. And then another way is just to go into the Endpoint Manager Admin Center here, right? And so either way, I'm going to have to sign in. And so I'm going to sign in. All right, and I'm signing in there. And then it's going to pop directly into the Endpoint Analytics node. Well, as soon as this happened, I think, well, okay, great. So how do I get there if I don't use the aka.ms, right? So I'm going to go away right there. You saw Endpoint Analytics starting to come up. Okay, and so I'm going into the Endpoint Manager Admin Center, and I want to access Endpoint Analytics from here. And so that's really easy to do. All I need to do is go down to Reports, and then on the Reports node, I will scroll down and I will see Endpoint Analytics. Endpoint Analytics, the overview window will pop up just like you saw it over here. So the two are identical, right? So I'm just going to close this one and we'll pop back in there in a minute. Now, here's the thing. We're talking about how you enable this with getting started, right? And what you just saw whenever I popped into the Endpoint Analytics node, I've already enabled it. And so I really can't show you how to enable it again. I guess I could put up another tenant and do it that way. It's really not necessary, right? Because what you're going to get, and this is true with ConfigMgr, it's true with Intune, if you have not enabled Endpoint Analytics, the question will be asked, how do you want to do this? Do you want to manage? You'll have a graphic, and then you'll have a drop down, and the drop down will simply say, I want to enable all cloud managed devices, or I want to manage select devices, or I will choose later. Basically, go ahead and set it up, and I will pick it later and go from there. Right? And so you have one of those three choices. And then once you make one of those three choices, you need to click Start. And that's it, right? That's all you need to do. And what happens is this. When you click Start, there's policy and configurations that happen behind the scenes that will be deployed to your devices, whether they are Intune managed or whether they are ConfigMgr managed, based on your selection. It could be all devices, could be select devices, whatever. But if they are Intune managed, then they will be receiving a deployment of those settings from Intune so that you can manage them accordingly. Now, so I will talk more about one aspect in just a second, but this seems like a good time to raise it. So I mentioned in the drop down, you will have a few choices. You will have either the select devices, or I will choose later, or the first one in the list is this one, all cloud managed devices. That wording is very, 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 very important to understand. All cloud managed devices. So I'm going to come back to that in just a second, but I want to call it out here, right? Okay, so that's Intune. That's getting things configured with Intune. Now, what about ConfigMgr? Strap yourselves in. Setting things up with ConfigMgr is so much more complicated. Kidding, right? It's really not hard. But before we get there, let's get into the ConfigMgr side. What are the requirements for Configuration Manager, right? So 2002 or better. We need 1903 or better, just like in Intune. We need a supported Windows 10 operating system for sure. And then we also need a couple of features enabled for Intune. And the first one is kind of the one I just alluded to. And I said I would come back to it. All cloud managed devices. What does that mean? That means devices that are managed through Intune directly or are managed through the Endpoint Manager Admin Center because they are tenant attached, right? Either way. So if it is not a tenant attached device in ConfigMgr, it will not participate in Endpoint Analytics. It must be tenant attached. So I've done a couple of sessions directly on tenant attached. I first introduced it in a session. Then I had a session that was focused directly on it. and then talked about some of the benefits of it directly, some of the associated benefits of having cloud attached management, such as being able to replicate config manager collections into Azure AD groups. And then here it is again, right? So one thing I hope you're getting a flavor of as we go along through this is the importance of the direction we're headed here. Tenant attach is a really big deal. It is where we're going to be investing a lot of effort going. You already see it, right? And so here's another one. If you want endpoint analytics and your devices are managed by config manager, you can have it, absolutely. But you can have it if your devices are tenant attached, cloud-based management. That's either tenant attached or Intune directly. Beyond that, you need to enable endpoint analytics data upload, which I'll show you how to do that in a minute, just a couple of clicks in the console. Talked about the proactive remediation scripting already. Licensing requirements. Here's some internet endpoints. Now, again, that might make you think of proxies. Already talked about that for a minute. Proxies will come up again in just a little bit. So let's go forward to how do we actually configure this in Configuration Manager. So to do that, let's pull in the Config Manager environment. And look, so I'm going to go to the administration node, and I'm going to go to Cloud Services, and I'm going to look at the co-management settings. You could do this on a wizard if you didn't already have co-management turned on, but I do. So I'm going to pop that up. It always this takes a minute. I don't know why. I need to rebuild my lab. Either way, there it is. Right. So you're going to go to Configure Upload. So this is the tenant attach piece right here. Right. This is where you enable endpoint analytics. Right. So that's just a check mark right here to enable endpoint analytics. The other place when you do this, and I'm drawing a blank on the version that was either 2010 or 2103, but there was a change in those versions to where if you enable endpoint analytics, by default, client settings will be configured to support uploading endpoint analytics data to Intune, right? And that's going to be by default in the default client settings. If you have custom client settings, then you would want to investigate those yourself to set those accordingly. But in the client settings under Computer Agent, there will be an option for enabling endpoint analytics data collection, and make sure you set that to yes for the devices that you want to participate in this. Right, and that's it in terms of configuring this in Config Manager. It really is just that simple. Right. Okay. Now, let's get this out of the way. So that's configuring. Now, how does this actually work in action? So I'm going to show you that. Right? So I mentioned before that I couldn't really show you. Oh, the other thing with setting up config manager, just like with Intune, you have to go into the endpoint analytics portal and you have to make one of those 3 drop-down choices, and then you have to click start. So that's true. Intune config manager doesn't matter, right? So the reason I went ahead and did that is because I wanted to be able to show you data that was live in my lab. My lab is boring, so it will be boring data to some degree, right? But I think hopefully you will understand the power that this will bring to your organization as we explore it here in just a second. Also, a reminder that this is a starting place. It is not the end of the development roadmap for this feature. And so stay tuned for more to come. But I wanted to put the screenshot here just out of our documentation to kind of give you a quick look at things. And then I want to pull in my environment that will show you directly my environment, right? So this is the overview page of Endpoint Analytics. So once you turn on Endpoint Analytics and settings are deployed to your clients, it will take a little bit of time for things to start to show up, right? But once they do, you can come to the overview page and you can get a good review of your scenarios. And so there's a couple of things I'll show you. First, as I mentioned before, you can actually see your organization's state compared to other similarly sized organizations in the world, right? Because we have data from all of them. Certainly your data is protected and kept to just you, but we can use that data kind of to give you a picture of where you stand compared to everyone else. You can also, and I'll show you this here, you can also configure your own baseline. I'll show you where to do that in just a second. So that if your organization has certain kinds of data requirements or performance requirements or whatever it is, you can define those yourself. and measure against your own metrics and see where you stack up. Either way, whatever you want to do. This is the one I chose. And then also your filter is all devices for now, right? So here you see the Endpoint Analytics score in general says you're meeting your goals. Now, you may not be meeting your goals. You may be meeting your goals. Hopefully you are. But that's where we give you this Endpoint Analytics score and what your baseline is that kind of relates to that score. And so here is your baseline marker. So you can see the baseline is at 33. That's a preset value. So you're exceeding that baseline, which means you're good, right? Okay. And then if we scroll down, you'll see some different categories that go into making up that score. So here is your startup performance. And here's where your baseline setting is of 50%. Now, this is the default baseline. Here's our recommended software, and here's our baseline. So you see that together, we're aggregating these to come up with the total baseline, which means you're good, right? Okay. And then we move on down and you will see an overview again of insights and recommendations that are out there for your particular environment. You can drill into these. It'll take you to different sections of the Endpoint Analytics console. So this is a good place to just kind of get a good sense. Now, there's places you can drill in. So if you want to look and drill in a bit, we can go to settings. And under settings, you're going to see how things are connected. So you definitely here will see Intune data collection policy. That's connected. You will also see your configuration manager data collection, and it is connected if you have it configured right. And then also you can decide whether you want to share your data or not. It's up to you, right? To contribute to that kind of aggregate score compared to other organizations. Up to you, right? The other thing that you can do here is look at your baseline and configure it as you. So to see that, I'm just going to click on baseline. And so you can go through, you see, these are the two baselines. Here's the one that's supplied by default. Here's one that I created. You can go create your own. There's different details that you can supply about baseline regression threshold and different things, right? So it's really up to you how you do that. That's where you do it. Now, in terms of the specific detail, oh, and one other thing I'll show you, if I go back to overview and I change my baseline, let's notice what happens. So here's my baseline, here's my score of 56 and 33. If I change my baseline, then the slider moves a little bit. The baseline changes to 23. So this is where you defining your baseline can have an impact. Now let's see what else is here. So if you want to specifically drill into startup performance, here is how we derive your startup score. And so the startup score here is 46, the baseline is 50, and then here's what goes into making up your score. So you have your core boot score. Mine isn't that great. Your core sign-in score, that's doing okay. Then you have your average startup time and your group policy and your time to your sign-in screen and time to your desktop and to a responsive desktop and different things, right? And some trends. Again, my lab is boring, but in your production environment, this wouldn't be so boring. It would be very interesting data to tell you how you're doing, right? And what your user experience ultimately is. There's other things you can go into. Model performance. I have all virtual machines, so there's not going to be anything really here that will break down by model, so I don't have any results. Here's my device performance. So I do have several different devices, and I can look across and see, okay, look, virtual machine, disk type unknown because they're all VMs. Here's my core boot time threshold, and look at this one. Wow, this one is 21. These other two are much higher. Is there a reason for that? I can use this to analyze. Is a good number of your are a good number of your machines performing very well, but then a subset are not? Why aren't they? Right? Are they a consistent model? Are they consistent disk type? Whatever. Here's the core sign-in time, and we can scan through those. Here's the number of restarts in the last 30 days that we can look at. That would be interesting. If we're having repeated blue screens, that would for sure be very interesting. We can export these. We can look at our total columns. We could actually add some more columns if we want to. Look at group policy sign-in time, time to responsive desktop. We could add those columns. We want to measure those and see those directly right there, right? Here we have startup processes. Again, mine are core virtual machines that don't have any real things that are added to the OS, so nothing here. We see restart frequency. I don't have anything but one device that I've done a restart on of late. And so, but you can see, you can drill into this. Are the restarts due to blue screens? Are they due to updates? Are they due to a long power button press, which could be an indication of maybe a problem, the system hung, so it was rebooted. Restarts without an update, restarts or shutdowns without an update, unknown reasons why we're restarting. All of these very pivotal information for your environment, and then your scores across your environment. Again, my lab, very, very boring. More stuff here. So in terms of proactive remediations, these are things that you might notice a trend of things happening in your environment, and you want to get ahead of that and resolve the issue before your users even notice, perhaps, or call the help desk. And so here's a couple of scripts that we have supplied for you for different scenarios, such as Office click to run has stopped, so you want to go ahead and restart it, or updating stale group policies. You can go add your own by creating scripting packages. If I go click on one, you can certainly scroll down. You can see the trends for that. You can go into properties of this, and you have full access to all the configuration. If you want to look at settings, you can see the script that's being applied in your environment, and you can have both a detection script for the problem, a remediation script to resolve the problem, and details about how to run the script. So very, very, very cool stuff to be able to go in and do this. And you can add your own, right, for sure, to take care of this. Now, other things. So recommended software. Now, this is not what you might initially think of, oh, here's software packages we would recommend, or things like that. No, this is broken down into categories of software. So what percentage of your devices run Windows 10? Which percentage have a cloud identity or cloud management? Which ones were built with autopilot, right? You can click on the information and see exactly what these blowouts mean: percentage of devices enrolled in Intune, percentage of devices registered in Active Directory, Azure Active Directory, and so on, right? So good overview of the environment. Here's some insights and recommendations that go along with that. And then finally, the last one, application reliability. Now, again, my lab, I have no problem with application reliability. But if you did, this is a great place to be able to go see what kind of responsiveness your apps have, right? So here's my app performance. Nothing here because I don't have any. Here's my model performance. Nothing here either. Here's my device performance. And I can see on my devices, here's one of the devices, and total app crashes in the past 14 days, mean time to app failure, and device app reliability score. You can also add, looks like all the columns are added, but I can modify the columns from there and so on. And then OS versions performance. So if there's a difference based on the version of the operating system that is being used, this is a great place to kind of highlight and identify those kind of details, well, all with the goal of trying to help you in terms of troubleshooting, understanding your environment, and so on. So that's really it in terms of showing you the feature, but I hope you have a sense of how useful this would be in your enterprise to really be able to understand your environment, the benefits of understanding this, and opportunities to improve in your environment, and so on, right? So as we begin to start to wrap up here, this is not, there's really not a whole lot of troubleshooting stuff to talk about, right? Yeah, there's different things you can want to make sure custom client settings get down to the device, all of that appropriately, but there's not a great deal of troubleshooting. This is a service that goes on. There could be troubleshooting of data going through and getting to the service, and that's where proxies come in and some of the components on the config manager side and so on, right? But there are a few things like known issues. And one of them is custom client settings may incorrectly indicate that Endpoint Analytics data collection is enabled. And that can really happen just because of some of the ways that things get set whenever you upgrade to a setting. So when you enable Endpoint Analytics data upload in ConfigMgr, data collection is automatically enabled in the default client settings. If any pre-existing custom client settings include the computer agent group, they may appear to have the enable endpoint analytics data set collection to true, but it may not be true. And so you might want to just reset this or whatever, right? The impacted devices will be anywhere your custom client settings impact the computer agent group settings. You might want to just look to verify in the resultant client settings for devices that are targeted by your custom client setting, just to make sure, right? Okay, and the way to fix that is just to toggle it. Another one is user experience blade may not be available in all devices report for some devices. And so that might be if the device is co-managed. So devices enrolled only via Intune or only via ConfigMgr are not affected, but if they are co-managed, it could be. The workaround, the user experience blade is available for all devices, including co-managed, within the Endpoint Analytics solution. If you want to navigate to startup performance, device performance, and then click to drill down into the device, then you can get around that, right? And then there's error code here that we see on our screen that says remediation failed. That can be if their profile assignment errors and so forth. Hardware inventory may fail to process, so some devices may fail to process after enabling endpoint protection on there. So there's some, in our documentation, we'll show you the kind of indications of what you will see in the inventory logs. And to work around this issue, you want to disable the collection of browser usage. Again, that's in our documentation. Script remediation may fail for proactive remediations. This could be because the enforced signature check is enabled, and you can remediate that. And then there's some issues where you might need to troubleshoot device enrollment and startup performance if there's some issues there. Again, our documentation goes through these in much more detail. Now we're to the proxy. So the first thing that I will say is, again, if you are deploying these endpoint analytics settings to devices managed directly by Intune, then yes, those devices will upload their data directly to Intune, and proxy may be an important thing for those devices. If these are ConfigMgr managed devices, then those devices do not send their data directly to Intune. Instead, they will send it to ConfigMgr, and ConfigMgr will send it forward to Intune. Either way, in terms of proxy, you need to make sure your endpoints are open in the right places. The best option for proxy is to configure bypass. That's the recommended option. So configure your proxy server to not require proxy auth for traffic to the data sharing endpoints, right? Most comprehensive for sure. There are details and settings you can do if you need to do user proxy auth and device proxy auth. Those are in our docs as well, so be sure to take a look. And then finally, some frequently asked questions. If any of these apply to you, then definitely take a look at our docs, and we'll answer these for you. And really, folks, that's it, right? Very, very, very important feature, very impactful to your environment, very useful information to be able to help troubleshoot your environment. So I wanted to share it with you, and we will watch to see how the feature evolves and new things that get added. So we will end this session here, and we will see you next time.